I'm so sorry for what I did. I constantly live in regret and shame because of it.
I find him to be pathetic and a coward, and someone that preyed on the most vulnerable person that he could find and attack her in her most vulnerable moment, in the middle of the night when she was asleep.
There's news of some closure in one of last year's most bizarre and disturbing stories.
A sentence tonight for the Medina County teenager who broke into the home of a 98-year-old woman, videotaped her sleeping before killing her and abusing her body.
They were barely old enough to drive. Some still rode the school bus, but behind their teenage faces hid a darkness most people can't begin to comprehend. These weren't impulsive outbursts or reckless mistakes. These were cold, calculated acts, planned, executed, and carried out with chilling precision. Victims ranged from strangers to siblings, children to the elderly. And in every case, the question wasn't if they were guilty, but how a child could become capable of such unimaginable violence. Law enforcement was left stunned, prosecutors demanded accountability, and the courts answered with adult sentences that would define the rest of their lives. Tonight, we expose the most cold-blooded teens ever sentenced as adults for crimes so unthinkable, even seasoned investigators struggled to sleep afterward. No mercy. No second chances. Just the raw, haunting truth about what happens when the mind of a child is consumed by something far darker than anyone saw coming. You've heard of teen rebellion, but this is something else entirely. This is Mindframe True Crimes. And what you're about to hear will stay with you. Case 1. Gavon Ramsay. In April 2018, Wadsworth, Ohio, the kind of quiet town where neighbors look out for each other and life moves at a familiar, predictable pace, became the stage for a violent rupture so shocking it challenged every notion of youthful innocence. 17-year-old Gavon Ramsay, living just a few blocks away, crossed a line that would forever alter not only a family's life, but the entire local perception of safety. The investigation began when police were alerted that 98-year-old Margaret Douglas had not been seen or heard from for days. Concerned family members forced their way into her home, only to discover her body hidden in a closet. Authorities quickly ruled the death a homicide. The victim, a fragile elderly widow living alone, had been strangled. Her body was then desecrated. Evidence of post-mortem abuse that shocked both investigators and the community. Detectives pieced together a disturbing narrative. Ramsay had targeted his elderly neighbor in her own home, strangled her to death, taken her wallet, and then returned to the scene to photograph her in a grotesque display of dominance and control. The presence of these images on his phone, along with the victim's wallet, provided a chilling confirmation of guilt. He was arrested in Cleveland nearly a week later, and the gravity of the crime led a grand jury to indict him on multiple charges, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, aggravated burglary, and gross abuse of a corpse. Prosecutors immediately moved the case from juvenile to adult court. What emerged in the psychological profile of Ramsay was not the impulsive behavior of a reckless youth, but rather calculated cruelty. He appeared motivated not by anger or retaliation, but by a disturbing compulsion to assert dominance. The act of desecration, returning to photograph the body, demonstrated emotional detachment and a predatory mindset. Experts describe traits consistent with antisocial behavior, including lack of empathy, disregard for human dignity, and a methodical approach to violence. These indicators strongly undermined any defense rooted in youthful immaturity alone. During legal proceedings, Ramsay initially pleaded not guilty, maintaining silence about his state of mind. But in November 2018, he changed his plea to no contest on all counts. During the courtroom hearing, he struggled to contain tears as he acknowledged his fate. The judge accepted the plea, and the case advanced to sentencing, scheduled for early January 2019. In the sentencing hearing, the prosecution painted a portrait of brutality, an elderly woman murdered in her home and displayed like an object. They argued that Ramsay's actions were not the product of hate or anger, but rather of cold calculation. The judge placed weight on his decision to return to the crime scene to photograph the body, a move prosecutors described as hallmark evidence of depravity. Families of the victim delivered emotional testimonies recounting Douglas's quiet kindness and the devastation left in her wake. The judge sentenced Ramsay to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Additional counts carried concurrent terms that ensured he would never be released. In court, the judge called the crime heartbreaking beyond measure, underscoring the betrayal of trust inherent in the death of a neighbor and a non-threatening elderly woman. For the victim's family, closure came with the certainty that justice would be served even as grief lingered. Beyond this particular case, Ramsay's crime raised broader questions in the criminal justice system about juvenile offenders who commit adult-level atrocities. Neuroscientific research highlights that adolescent brains are still developing critical areas responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning. Yet the legal precedent here was clear. Certain crimes betray signs of intent, power, and planning that outweigh arguments rooted in adolescence. Ohio's laws permitted the transfer to adult court precisely because the nature of the crime displayed factors often associated with adult guilt. One learned public safety takeaway is the crucial need for secure homes, especially around vulnerable populations. Douglas's home contained unlocked entryways that were exploited. The case also underscores the need for mental health assessment among youth, displaying isolation, fascination with control, or detachment. Even without criminal history, signs of behavioral disturbance must be taken seriously before tragedy escalates. From a law enforcement perspective, the case exemplifies what effective, high-integrity investigation looks like. Detectives combine neighborhood canvassing, digital forensics, and witness interviews to build an airtight case. The discovery of photos on Ramsay's phone was crucial. Digital evidence backtracking to the day of the murder eliminated ambiguity and paved the way for a swift prosecution. Inside the courtroom, trial testimony served as the battleground for competing narratives. Was this an impulsive youthful misstep or calculated depravity? With expert testimony addressing Ramsay's emotional detachment and chilling willingness to desecrate a corpse, the jury and judge concluded there was little space for rehabilitation, only accountability. Rehabilitation, while technically available under U.S. correctional frameworks, effectively became moot in Ramsay's case. Life without parole offers no path to redemption. Instead, the sentence stands as an irreversible statement. When youth commits violence so calculated, justice may draw a line that rehabilitation cannot cross. Critics of juvenile transfer laws argue that such sentences undermine rehabilitation's purpose, while others insist society must protect itself from perpetrators who show no remorse or empathy. Ultimately, the story of Gavon Ramsay is not merely a headline. It is a psychological study in how cold cruelty can emerge from a child's mind. It challenges communities to understand that evil isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is silent, calculated, and barely seen until it's too late. The case continues to be referenced in criminal justice discourse, especially in debates over juvenile transfer laws, life without parole sentencing for minors, and the ethical tensions between rehabilitation and public safety. Ramsay's actions and his resulting sentence stand as a stark reminder that when youth commits atrocity, the system may respond with adult severity, and in tragic cases, a decision that no possibility of return exists. This remains a cautionary tale about unchecked darkness, unaddressed emotional detachment, and communities unprepared for cruelty they believe could never come from someone so young. Case 2. Dexter Johnson. In June 2006, Houston streets became the stage for a violent crime spree led by an 18-year-old named Dexter Johnson. The investigation began after two young victims, Maria Apareche, 23, and her boyfriend, Huy Ngo, 17, were carjacked while sitting in their vehicle. Witnesses say Johnson and accomplices forced them into a car at gunpoint, then drove them to a remote, wooded location. There, tragedy unfolded. Johnson allegedly raped Maria while the victim's boyfriend was made to watch, before both were executed with gunshots to the head. Their bodies were abandoned in the woods, later discovered by police. The rapid escalation of the spree, 5 homicides in approximately 25 days, indicated organizational planning and detachment. Johnson and his group continued a pattern of robbery, violence, and manipulation across Houston. The forensic investigation combined witness testimony, ballistic evidence, and digital tracking of the stolen vehicle. Authorities swiftly identified Johnson and his companions, arrested them, and linked them to the crimes through physical and testimonial evidence. A psychological profile revealed serious concerns about Johnson's mental functioning. Attorneys later claimed he had sustained traumatic brain injury and exhibited signs of intellectual disability, an essential argument given its implications for death penalty eligibility. Observers noted his stutter, difficulty managing funds or understanding simple instructions, and limited adaptive behavior. Experts asserted these issues, along with lowered IQ scores, pointed toward diminished culpability. Prosecutors countered that the planning, emotional coldness, and continued violence throughout the spree showed Johnson acted with awareness and intent, not mental incapacity. During legal proceedings, Johnson was tried in adult court for capital murder. Testimony recounted the brutality of the spree, the sexual assault, coercion of the victims, and the use of stolen property and firearms. The prosecution emphasized intent and coordination, arguing the crimes reflected predatory behavior, not the recklessness of adolescence. The defense introduced medical evaluations and psychological assessments to argue that Johnson's intellectual disability should preclude execution under the Supreme Court's precedent in Atkins v. Virginia. Ultimately, the jury found him guilty of robbery, kidnapping, murder, and sexual assault. In 2007, Johnson was sentenced to death for his role in the murders. Trial testimony and victim impact statements weighed heavily in the sentencing hearing. The families of Maria and Hai spoke openly about grief and the need for closure. Johnson addressed the court, claiming innocence, yet offering a final apology. "No amount of words could ever undo what I've done," he said, though he simultaneously denied responsibility. The judge affirmed the jury's decision, citing the unrelenting cruelty of the crime spree. However, the path toward execution was halted. In 2019, a federal appeals court issued a stay of execution less than 24 hours before Johnson's scheduled death. The court ordered further review of new claims about his intellectual disability, his stutter, and impaired functioning, factors potentially warranting exemption from capital punishment under U.S. constitutional law. The ruling sent the case back to lower courts, acknowledging that evolving medical standards and evidence merited re-examination. On appeal, defenders argued that Johnson should have been deemed intellectually disabled and thus ineligible for execution. Courts noted that earlier evaluations had ruled he had low average IQ scores, but new neuropsychological testing suggested deficits consistent with disability. Still, Texas courts initially rejected these claims. Ultimately, the execution was stayed and death sentence overturned. Johnson was re-sentenced to life without parole, aligned with Texas statutes barring intellectually disabled individuals from execution. This case sparked broader discussions around juvenile culpability, intellectual disability, and capital punishment. Critics argued that Johnson's original defense failed to raise disability issues in a timely manner, leading to constitutional concerns about representation and fairness. Meanwhile, legal scholars pointed to Supreme Court decisions like Moore v. Texas and Atkins v. Virginia, which reaffirm that courts must apply clinical standards, not stereotypes, when assessing eligibility for capital punishment based on mental impairment. From a social perspective, the story raises urgent public safety takeaways. Early intervention in the lives of teens exhibiting cognitive or behavioral challenges, difficulty schooling, stuttering, emotional dysregulation, might diffuse violent trajectories. Community programs, mental health evaluations, and accessible support structures are critical to prevent escalation in vulnerable youth. Law enforcement's response in identifying and prosecuting Johnson's group exemplifies procedural thoroughness. Investigators secured crime scenes, followed physical and digital evidence, and built a strong case through corroborated testimony. The seamless investigation allowed justice to proceed quickly, preserving confidence in the system even while legal complexities remained. At the heart of the courtroom drama lay a tension. Should a teen who commits adult-level violence also receive adult consequences when intellectual disability is in question? The initial death sentence reflected society's need for accountability, while the later commutations reflect compassion for neurological impairment as a factor in culpability. Although rehabilitation is no longer in the cards for Johnson, life without parole ensures he will never rejoin society. The case remains a testament to how legal systems navigate evolving scientific insights while balancing the demands of justice and public safety. Prosecutors defended society's right to protect itself. Defense advocates emphasized medical and developmental science. The judicial system ultimately drew a line, recognizing that severe mental impairment can alter moral responsibility, and adjusted Johnson's sentence accordingly. Dexter Johnson's trajectory, from violent spree at age 18 to death row inmate, through appeals to final life sentence, continues to fuel debates in criminal justice reform, juvenile sentencing policy, and capital punishment jurisprudence. His case surfaces profound questions. How should system account for cognitive deficits when evaluating intent? When does rehabilitation matter more than punishment? And can science guide morality in legal sentencing? Beyond the courtroom verdicts, this story serves as a reminder. Unchecked trauma, intellectual disability, or emotional instability in youth can lead to irreversible outcomes. It forces communities to confront how they support struggling adolescents, and how legal systems must learn to distinguish between culpable youth and those whose minds falter in ways the law must consider. Case 3. Deonte James Green. In October 2017 in Tulsa County, Oklahoma, a violent crime spree by one teenager shattered lives and tested the boundaries of juvenile justice in America. 14-year-old, or actually 16 at the time, Deonte James Green embarked on a day of terror that left 2 dead, 1 mentally scarred, and a legal system forced to confront just how far a young mind could fall. While not in New York, his case resonates across states. He was tried as an adult and sentenced to life without parole, a sentence reflecting both the brutality of the crimes and the court's refusal to mitigate based on age. The investigation began after authorities responded to a brutal home invasion. The body of 23-year-old Shane Anderson, a middle school teacher, was discovered shot in his Broken Arrow home. During the investigation, the elderly parents of an 81-year-old woman revealed they were robbed at gunpoint earlier. The woman was later found raped in her own home. Investigators soon linked these crimes. Surveillance, ballistic tests, and eyewitness accounts pointed to Green and his accomplices. Within days, arrests were made, and law enforcement assembled a case built on digital traces, forensic evidence, and statements from victims. Green's criminal history stretched back years. Contacts with police beginning at age 11, indicating early behavior issues. This long struggle with authority impressed upon prosecutors that the spree was not a single lapse, but the culmination of escalating violence. The psychological profile presented by both sides became central. The prosecution portrayed Green as callous and intentional, someone who planned, forced cooperation, and used a gun without remorse. His emotional detachment was highlighted by witness accounts and his own inconsistent statements. The defense countered by calling attention to his youth and instability, suggesting intellectual disability, impulsivity, and poor impulse control. When legal proceedings began, Green entered a blind plea to first-degree murder and nearly 20 other counts, including robbery, kidnapping, rape, burglary, and firearm charges. Without a plea agreement, a blind plea allowed sentencing at the judge's discretion and avoided a drawn-out trial, but offered little opportunity to explore rehabilitation arguments. Despite this, some mental health assessments suggested he functioned below average cognitively and may have struggled with executive decision-making. In the sentencing hearing, the judge handed down life without parole, plus an additional 290 years in prison, ensuring Green would spend the rest of his life incarcerated. Victim impact statements underscored the emotional toll. Darcy Anderson, the slain teacher's widow, described her late husband as devoted and kind, mourning not just her loss, but naming Green irreparably corrupt and permanently incorrigible. The judge concurred. This was no horrific impulsive act, but the work of a young person who had shown no capacity for reform and whose dangerousness extended beyond his age. This case captured national attention because it raised uncomfortable debates on juvenile justice. The U.S. Supreme Court's rulings in Atkins v. Virginia and Miller v. Alabama established that juveniles with intellectual disabilities should not face capital punishment or mandatory life without parole. Yet Green's case fell outside those protections. State tribunals determined his cognitive level did not meet the threshold for disability exemption, a critical legal distinction. Courts upheld that life without parole was appropriate due to the intentional, premeditated violence, not youthful impulsiveness. Beyond legal wrangling, this case shines a light on systemic failures. Green had contacts with law enforcement since childhood, yet opportunities for early intervention, therapy, school-based psychological support, mentorship appear to have been missed. His arrest, plea, and sentencing span reflects a system more reactive than preventive. Community outreach, behavioral programming, and youth mental health services may have altered his trajectory before it turned lethal. Law enforcement's role in the case underscores procedural excellence. Multiple agencies collaborated: crime scene detectives, forensic analysts, roadside observers, digital investigators. Witness accounts, bank card use, and ballistic matches coalesced into a solid case. The rapid, thorough investigation minimized room for doubt, and the prosecution's evidence was presented with clarity and precision. Courtroom testimony proved equally decisive. Forensic pathologists described cause of death, the rape victim and family provided victim impact statements, detectives detailed behavior and admissions, and prosecutors illustrated how Green moved from robbery to rape to murder in a single, violent day. The defense offered glimpses of emotional fragility, but failed to counter the prevailing narrative of calculated, escalating violence. Ultimately, the jury and judge prioritized public safety over any hope of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation, in cases like this, becomes theoretical at best. Green's sentence offers no opportunity for review, parole, or structured psychological growth, essentially removing any hope for redemption. Critics argue that the system should make room for transformation, even for violent young offenders. Supporters maintain that some crimes leave no room for rehabilitation when they demonstrate such a profound disregard for life. Green's sentence reflects the latter judgment. Psychologically, the case reveals the darkest possibilities when adolescence converges with violent intent. Experts cite the adolescent brain's ongoing development, still maturing in areas tied to impulse control and empathy. Yet in Green's case, the evidence pointed not to a moment of teenage irrationality, but a trajectory of escalating criminal behavior. His actions across multiple victims in a single day reflect planning and emotional disengagement rarely seen even in adult criminals. From a broader social perspective, the Deonte Green case demands reflection on prevention. Schools and communities must prioritize early identification of youth in crisis. Social isolation, prior criminal contacts, behavioral changes. Better resources for mental health assessments in juvenile systems, trauma-informed care in schools, and communication channels across agencies could help identify and intervene earlier. Communities must also ensure that juvenile arrests prompt not just punitive measures, but psychological evaluation and rehabilitative planning. In the end, the story of Deonte James Green is not simply one of violence and punishment. It is a cautionary narrative about what happens when early warning signs go unaddressed, when psychological fragility and moral boundaries fail to converge in youth. It reveals how the criminal justice system sometimes chooses finality over redemption and the difficult balance between protecting communities and believing in the potential for change. More broadly, it forces society to ask, how much weight should age have when violence is systematic, predatory, and devastating? His case remains cited in ongoing policy debates about juvenile sentencing reform, capital punishment limitations, and the importance of intellectual disability assessments in legal defense. And though the verdict has been rendered, the human fallout continues. 2 lives lost, multiple families destroyed, a community left to question how a teenager could walk such a destructive path and whether the system could have prevented the descent before it became irreversible. Case 4. Aiden Vongrao. The quiet corridors of a Colorado high school masked a terrifying secret, one that would shatter a community's sense of safety and force society to confront the unsettling gap between adolescence and intent. In November 2017, Aiden Vongrao, just 15 at the time, walked into the apartment building of a young woman living in Longmont and committed an act so deliberate, so chilling, that investigators, prosecutors, and mental health professionals alike found themselves asking, what does it mean when a teenager commits a crime with the precision of a seasoned predator? The investigation began when 20-year-old Michaela Grote failed to emerge from her apartment. Inside the breezeway, first responders found her fatally stabbed. Surveillance cameras showed a figure dressed in dark motorcycle gear moving through the scene, later identified as Vongrao. Police recovered him hours later, parked nearby. A notebook in his possession revealed chilling premeditation, a kill list with names and violent instructions, including targeting Grote's sister. Authorities also seized weapons and tactical gear purchased through his grandfather's Amazon account. Molotov cocktail materials, knives, gloves, and black clothing, evidence the teenager had planned further violence. The psychological profile that emerged was deeply disturbing. Experts testified Vongrao exhibited traits consistent with emotional detachment, obsession with control, and an alarming fascination with death. He had planned multiple attacks, targeting acquaintances with phrases like, "torture till she begs for mercy." Defense counsel later argued he suffered from drug-induced psychosis, blaming Accutane, an acne medication, for altering his mental state in a manner that undermined his capacity for empathy or clear judgment. Prosecutors countered that none of this mitigated the cold logic and manipulation he displayed. This was a case not of teenage impulse, but calculated psychological danger. The decision to try Vongrao as an adult came swiftly. Judges and prosecutors agreed this wasn't a misstep, but a premeditated escalation. During legal proceedings, the prosecution presented testimony from police, forensic analysts, and computer experts, weaving together surveillance, purchase history, and witness statements into a narrative of intent and planning. Vongrao faced charges including first-degree murder, stalking, attempted murder, menacing, criminal extortion, and more. The court transferred the case to adult jurisdiction in March 2018 after a hearing that examined his behavior leading up to the crime, notably including the threats, weapons cache, and disturbed mindset. In the trial testimony, prosecutors highlighted how he targeted Grote's sister after she reported him, prompting a violent response shaped by vengeance. They detailed how he avoided detection by donning gloves and washing before and after the act, showing awareness of forensic risk. Defense arguments centered around mental health experts who claimed possible antidepressant interaction and medication side effects impaired his judgment. They attempted to present him as a psychotic adolescent rather than a rational threat. But jurors were not persuaded. On May 3, 2019, Vongrao entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder and multiple related charges. Without a plea agreement, sentencing fell to the judge's discretion. In the sentencing hearing, prosecutors argued for life due to the unambiguous planning and betrayal of trust. Victims' family members described the emotional toll, the fear, the lists, the knowledge that a list existed with their names on it. The judge concluded that Vongrao's mind had crossed a boundary that adolescence could not excuse. He handed down life in prison, with parole eligibility only after 40 years, and additional consecutive terms for the other counts. This case sits at the intersection of unsettling psychology and a justice system grappling with juvenile responsibility. Neuroscience teaches that adolescent brains are still forming, particularly in areas tied to empathy, impulse control, and risk assessment. Yet here was evidence of meticulous planning, a kill list, tactical gear purchases, and deliberate surveillance avoidance. For the courts, these facts outweighed arguments about brain immaturity or medication side effects. One of the most critical public safety lessons is vigilance over warning signs. School administrators, parents, and counselors need robust protocols for flagging behavior like obsession with weapons, death lists, threats, and social isolation. Community mental health resources must be equipped to intervene early, long before a teenager escalates to violence. The presence of violence fantasies or expressed hurt should prompt immediate assessment and intervention. Law enforcement's work in the case highlights exemplary investigative practice. Digital forensics uncovered the online purchases and death list. Witness interviews corroborated his presence. Surveillance and ballistic connections built the case with precision. The investigation left little room for misinterpretation, a critical achievement in dealing with complex juvenile crime. Courtroom dynamics also underscore the tension between rehabilitation and public safety. Vongrao had been part of a post-Columbine threat monitoring program. School officials had already flagged him as a potential risk. His defense argued that systems failed him neurologically. Prosecutors emphasized the threat he posed to others, if not stopped. Ultimately, the judiciary drew a line where society demanded protection over treatment. Rehabilitation in cases like this becomes a theoretical debate. Vongrao will be eligible for parole only after decades, and given the nature of his crimes and psychological profile, it may remain hypothetical. Critics argue that holding out hope for rehabilitation, even in extreme cases, aligns with juvenile justice principles. Supporters believe some acts signal a break too severe to risk potential rehabilitation. The balance is delicate, and the debate far from settled. More broadly, Aiden Vongrao's case is often cited in policy discussions around juvenile sentencing, youth mental health, and school safety. The concept of kill lists is increasingly recognized as a significant risk factor, prompting schools to adopt threat assessment teams and confidential reporting. Discussions about adolescent substance effects, especially psychiatric medication, continue, but with caution. Courts require thorough medical analysis before attributing behavior to medication-induced impairment. In the end, this story confronts us with uncomfortable realities. Adolescence does not guarantee innocence. A teenager's mind, when untethered from empathy and entangled in obsession, can execute violence with precision. It forces society to reckon with how we detect, evaluate, and respond to such individuals before tragedy strikes. Case 5. Racelyn Martin. In August 2016, a quiet Fayetteville neighborhood collapsed under an act so disturbing it left investigators searching for explanations, not just for the violence, but for a mind young enough to be considered innocent. Racelyn Martin, aged 17 at the time, attacked his 63-year-old grandfather, Joseph Emmett Nolte, wielding a hatchet in a crime that would challenge assumptions about youth, intent, and justice. The investigation began when Martin's father discovered his father's body in bed, covered in blood and brutally attacked. 31 hatchet wounds, 15 to the head, according to autopsy reports. Martin was found nearby, also bloodied, with the bloody weapon on the floor. Investigators found deleted messages on his phone, 107 pages recovered, showing conversations where he planned the attack, calling his grandfather kinda inconvenient, and even discussing poison before switching to a hatchet long before the attack occurred. These messages revealed something chilling. This was not a crime of momentary rage, but a goal-focused, premeditated decision. Prosecutors moved swiftly to treat Martin as an adult. Though the crime occurred when he was a juvenile, The scale and planning behind the attack triggered adult court jurisdiction. The psychological profile that emerged in court revealed layers of trauma, instability, and detachment. Defense attorneys painted Martin as emotionally neglected, homeschooled, socially isolated, grappling with mental health concerns such as bipolar and conduct disorders, and even the aftermath of a suicide attempt earlier that year. His father allegedly encouraged him, in a taunting way, to consider killing his grandfather. But prosecution experts pointed to the cold precision in Martin's behavior. Deleted messages, changing weapons, calculated intent, and lack of fear during and after the act. These elements underscored emotional detachment and a willingness to plan violence over time. The act wasn't out of impulse. It was the result of a young mind disconnected from empathy and driven by resentment. During legal proceedings, Martin initially pled not guilty, but in February 2018, he entered a guilty plea for first-degree murder. Prosecutors emphasized that his actions reflected adult-level decision-making rather than youthful impulsivity. The plea allowed the judge to decide sentencing without jury deadlock, but it also meant Martin had to reckon with the full weight of adult consequences in court. The sentencing hearing was intense. Victim impact testimony painted a picture of a grandfather once accused of bullying Martin and blamed within the family for emotional harm. The judge weighed this against the premeditated cruelty of the act, noting that Martin's admission of guilt and his digital record offered little mitigation. Ultimately, he was sentenced to life in prison, but with parole eligibility after 25 years, offering a rare hybrid of accountability and potential for restoration given his youth. This case raised broader questions about juvenile justice. Supreme Court rulings such as Miller v. Alabama prohibit mandatory life without parole for juveniles, but states retain discretion. In this instance, Martin's case was remarkable because it deviated from absolute life sentences sometimes handed out, reflecting the judge's recognition of both the extremity of the crime and the possibility, not certainty, of future change. From a public safety perspective, lessons are stark. Monitoring youth isolation, sudden behavioral shifts, or expressed fantasies about violence, like Martin's online plotting, can be critical. Schools and caregivers must treat red flags seriously, ensuring early mental health intervention and structured support before escalation occurs. Apps like Kik, which Martin used anonymously to detail his plan, show the digital space can amplify and even facilitate violent premeditation, underscoring a need for oversight and education in online behaviors. Law enforcement demonstrated procedural strength throughout the case. Investigators preserved digital and physical evidence, traced deleted content, and coordinated digital forensics with traditional interviews. That combination formed the backbone of the investigation and supported a conviction grounded in clarity and credibility, even amid psychological complexity. Courtroom testimony across both sides highlighted the tension between psychology and accountability. Mental health experts described Martin as emotionally fragile and neglected. Prosecutors countered that his planning and messaging revealed a rational actor making choices. Jurors and the sentencing judge sided with the latter interpretation, indicating that when intent is clear, age may not lessen culpability. Rehabilitation remains theoretically available to Martin, though he faces decades before parole eligibility. Opportunities for educational programming, therapy, and restorative justice exist within correctional systems. However, his early behavior, such as plotting details of murder through anonymous apps, casts doubt on his willingness or capacity to engage meaningfully. Still, the legal framework preserved at least the possibility of growth, evidence that even juvenile justice systems can acknowledge both protection and potential change. Psychologically, Martin's journey is a case study in how trauma and isolation can fuse with resentment into premeditated violence. His mental health struggles, familial dynamics, and online messaging all fed into a narrative of a teenager who crossed dangerous cognitive and moral thresholds. Whether his neurotransmitters, medication side effects, or social environment bore weight, the court determined his planning distinguished the act from adolescent recklessness. In the broader discourse on juvenile homicide, Martin's case remains instructive. It demonstrates how modern neuroscience and criminal justice must coexist. Youth brains develop over time, but when planning matches adult-level intent, courts may lean toward punishment. It's a reminder that rehabilitation is not guaranteed, but remains legally permitted in some youth homicide cases. The community fallout was significant. The horror that someone so young could plan and execute violence with calm deliberation left lasting mistrust. Yet Martin's sentencing balance, life with parole, not life without parole, showed a justice system striving to acknowledge both horror and youth. That tension continues in policy debates nationwide about when to draw lines between developmental growth and moral culpability. Racelyn Martin's trajectory, from a troubled teen communicating anonymously about murder to a prisoner serving a sentence that may extend into middle age, stands as a chilling, cautionary tale. It emphasizes psychological warning signs, the need for early mental health intervention, and the responsibility of institutions to act before violence erupts. While justice was served, the unanswered questions remain. How much could have prevented the collapse of a young mind? And whether that same system now charged with punishment might also offer space, no matter how small, for redemption. In the end, this story asks a sharper question. What does it mean when a teenager talks openly online about killing someone, calls it justified, and then follows through? And how should society respond? With punishment, prevention, or both? Racelyn Martin's case suggests that sometimes both are necessary, and that the line between adolescent misbehavior and moral collapse can be narrower than we think. Case 6. Brian Lee Draper. In the quiet suburbs of Pocatello, Idaho, on the night of September 22, 2006, a tragedy unfolded that would shock not only a close-knit community, but the entire nation. Two teenage boys, Brian Lee Draper and Tori Adamsick, both just 16 at the time, lured their friend Cassie Jo Stoddart into what was supposed to be an ordinary evening. What happened next would shatter the illusion of teenage innocence and leave investigators confronting a chilling truth. This was no momentary lapse, but a premeditated act of violence steeped in calculation, fantasy, and a disturbing detachment from reality. The investigation revealed a methodical plan. Draper and Adamsick, inspired by horror films like Scream and the Columbine shootings, recorded documentary-style videos detailing their intention to murder. Draper even authored an essay titled Columbine, outlining how he intended to create a massacre. On the night of the murder, they infiltrated the house where Cassie, a classmate, was house-sitting with her boyfriend. After programming their masks, gloves, and meticulously purchased knives, the two attacked, stabbing her repeatedly. The crime scene bore the echoes of a slasher movie, but its real-world horror was undeniable. What made this case psychologically compelling was the access to their own recorded confessions. The video footage captured both boys discussing, planning, and executing the crime. "We're going for a high death count," Draper declared in the video. "We're going to make history." The tone was detached, almost gleeful, revealing a disturbing emotional void and fascination with notoriety. Forensic psychologists later described traits consistent with antisocial behavior and a chilling pursuit of infamy. These were not impulsive teenagers acting on a dare. They were documenting their own terror with cold intent. Once arrested, both were tried as adults. The legal proceedings featured overwhelming testimony, video confession, physical evidence linking the weapons and costumes, and digital records of their planning. Witness accounts confirmed their timeline, as forensic explains detailed their movements from knife purchase to house entry. Prosecutors emphasized that these actions showed deliberation, not a moment of youthful recklessness. Defense attorneys attempted to introduce evidence suggesting they were simply teenagers wearing horror masks, perhaps not fully understanding the gravity. But the video evidence, so personal and direct, left jurors no ambiguity. Lives were stolen by intent, not mistake. The trial testimony pivoted around the tapes and essays the boys had created. Draper and Adamczyk had spoken openly about their motivations, even musing that they would go down in history like serial killers or film characters. The judge and jury saw how Draper filmed Cassie greeting him in the school hall earlier that day, then returned hours later fully masked. The dichotomy between his real life and his recorded life underscored a reality where fantasy triumphed over morality. At the sentencing hearing in August 2007, both Draper and Adamczyk received fixed life sentences without possibility of parole. The judge cited their planning, execution, and the betrayal of friendship as evidence that rehabilitation was not a realistic outcome. Victim impact statements echoed the pain of losing a vibrant teenager, someone viewed as caring and kind by her peers and family. The verdict was final. These were not crimes of teenage confusion. They were cold actions taken by calculated minds. This case underscores broader criminal justice debates. When juveniles commit adult-level violence, can they still be classified as children in need of rehabilitation? Neuroscience indicates that teenage brains are still forming the areas responsible for empathy, impulse control, and foresight. Yet in Draper's case, the planning, documentation, and emotional detachment pointed to adult cognition about violence rather than adolescent impulsivity. Courts must weigh rehabilitative potential against genuine public safety risk, and Draper's file showed little opportunity for redemption. Public safety lessons from this case are clear. First, fascination with violence, fantasies of infamy, or fixations on real-world attacks should never be dismissed as adolescent dramatics. Early counseling, mental health support, and behavioral assessments in schools could identify dangerous ideations before they escalate. Second, open or deleted content on digital devices, like videos, essays, or message logs, can be critical evidence. Parents and educators must maintain reasonable oversight without infringing on privacy, especially when alarming content appears. Law enforcement's handling of the case exemplified procedural excellence. Investigators recovered video footage, traced purchases of masks and knives, secured the crime scene with minimal contamination, and conducted thorough interviews. Their digital forensics uncovered custom horror films shot by the perpetrators, describing their plan in detail. That level of methodical documentation fortified the investigation, making the prosecution's case airtight. Courtroom dynamics here revealed tensions that define juvenile homicide trials. Prosecutors emphasized public safety and intentionality. Defense counsel emphasized age, developmental immaturity, and mental health. Jury deliberations weighed recorded evidence against psychological theories. The eventual sentencing reflected a decision that some acts, no matter the age, warrant adult accountability. Rehabilitation, while technically permitted by Idaho law, remains theoretical in his case. He has no opportunity for release, eliminating rehabilitation as a practical outcome. Critics argue that even youthful offenders deserve a path to redemption. Supporters assert that calculated brutality merits irreversible consequence. Draper's case stands on the latter side, a legal acknowledgement that some acts erase youthful innocence permanently. At its core, this case is a study of how a teenage mind can fracture when influenced by violence, infamy's appeal, and emotional detachment. Draper and Adamczyk were high-achieving, socially accepted teens, until their creations unveiled a narrative of destruction. Researchers often point to warning signs: creation of kill lists, homemade films glorifying violence, isolation, and grandiose ideations. These mustn't be overlooked. Today, the case remains a reference point in policy discussions about juvenile sentencing, mental health in schools, and threat assessment protocols. It highlights how legal systems evaluate intent, capacity, and risk, and how society struggles to balance punishment and prevention. The videos, essays, and judicial transcripts serve as stark reminders that the darker corners of adolescent psychology can turn real and irreversible very quickly. Lee Draper's trajectory, from teenager enthralled by horror to convicted murderer serving life without parole, remains a critical lesson in unchecked fantasy colliding with reality. It demands vigilance from communities, schools, justice systems, and caregivers to identify, intervene, and understand before aggression becomes action. The question Draper's case poses is not whether a young mind could plot murder. It's why we didn't see it coming sooner. Case 7. Michael and Robert Bever. In early 2015, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, known for its quiet streets and tight-knit community, was shattered by a crime so calculated and chilling it left investigators, families, and courts questioning how teenagers could cross a line from youth to horror. It was the summer of July 22nd when two brothers, Michael and Robert Bever, turned their own family into a massacre. Homeschool graduates living under parental control, the brothers had spent months planning and fantasizing. When authorities responded to a 911 call from their 12-year-old brother Daniel, they arrived to find the parents and 3 of the younger siblings brutally slain. Daniel managed to trigger the call before being ambushed and killed in his room. 2 sisters, aged 13 and 2, survived, one hiding while under attack. The survivors later identified Michael and Robert, then aged 16 and 18 respectively, as the perpetrators. What emerged from the crime scene was more than familicide. It was evidence of calculation and contempt that stunned forensic experts and legal professionals alike. Early in the investigation, detectives uncovered evidence of long-term planning. Both brothers had amassed weapons, body armor, stab tools, and messaged each other about fame. Robert confided in investigators that the brothers aspired to outdo mass shootings like Columbine and Aurora, even discussing dismemberment, storage bins for bodies in their attic, and a cross-country crime spree targeting strangers after the attack. This level of premeditation shaped the trajectory of the case. Both were charged as adults under Oklahoma law that allows transfer when intent and danger are clear. The psychological profile emerged during legal preparation. Defense attorneys painted Michael as manipulated by his older brother, socially isolated by homeschooling, and emotionally neglected. Robert sometimes hinted at verbal abuse at home and resentment toward his father, who, he claimed, spoke often about hate and biblical Armageddon as justification for violence. Prosecutors countered with a darker portrait. Both brothers were cold-blooded, detached, and obsessed with infamy. They planned, executed, and even sought attention after their brutal act. Their legal proceedings escalated quickly. Robert pleaded guilty in 2016 to 5 counts of first-degree murder and received 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Michael went to trial in 2018 and was convicted of 5 murder counts and assault with intent to kill their surviving sister. A jury recommended life with parole eligibility, but the judge overrode it, ordering Michael's 5 life sentences to run consecutively, which effectively removes any realistic chance of release. Trial testimony revealed every detail: how they selected the time, prepared weapons and clothing, subdued and stabbed victims, and even rang the doorbell afterward to lure more victims. Statements by survivors and forensic pathologists laid bare the cruelty and betrayal. Victim impact testimony brought raw grief. Family members described the loss of parents and children, the betrayal of trust, and the cowardice of violence from within one's own home. The court, in sentencing, described the act as more than murder. It was a symbolic severing of innocence and humanity, something no adolescent plea could excuse. The sentencing hearing became a focal point for broader criminal justice discussion. Defense attorneys pointed to Supreme Court rulings, including Miller v. Alabama, which restricts mandatory life without parole for juveniles. Yet, prosecutors emphasized that these brothers fit exceptions. Multiple murders, unrelenting planning, a record beyond youthful impulsivity. As one district attorney declared, mass murderers, even teens, are fundamentally different and must face severe adult consequences. From a public safety perspective, the case offers grim lessons: isolation, radicalization of resentment, and fascination with violence, especially when siblings share these impulses, warrant attention. Parents, educators, and caregivers must watch for red flags: prolonged behavioral deterioration, weapon access, or extremist fantasies. early mental health intervention, community engagement, and open communication may deter escalation before tragedy strikes. Law enforcement's response in the Bever case was methodical and swift. Investigators preserved digital evidence, including recorded messages, weapon procurement logs, and survival gear. Ballistics investigators confirmed knife matches, and detectives reconstructed timelines with detailed surveillance and interviews. The investigation required coordination across jurisdictions, forensic experts, and child welfare services, a model of modern criminal process in shocking circumstances. Courtroom dynamics reflected the tension between psychological nuance and public accountability. While defense experts described Michael as emotionally vulnerable and influenced, prosecutors presented interviews in which Robert expressed a desire for fame and grandiosity. The jury and judge sided with the logic that intent, planning, and betrayal outweighed potential youthful impairment. The ruling underscored that when juvenile crimes mirror adult-level violence, rehabilitation may become legally secondary to community protection. Rehabilitation, while still possible under Oklahoma law, became a theoretical concept in practice. Michael's minimal parole eligibility permission has little practical weight when consecutive sentencing means decades before even being considered. Robert's multiple life sentences without parole eliminate hope. Critics argue this undermines rehabilitative goals of juvenile justice, while proponents assert that public safety must prevail when intent is clear. The Bever brothers' case remains a reference point in ongoing policy debates. Juvenile transfer laws, the interplay of mental health and criminal responsibility, and when teen crimes transform into strategies for notoriety. Their planning, messaging, and digital evidence serve as reminders that adolescent violence can be as calculated as it is destructive. More than headlines, this story cuts to psychological core. When betrayal is close and violence is pre-planned, how far can youthful disillusionment go? Michael and Robert Bever turned their own home into a site of horror. They violated every boundary of trust, family, and societal expectations. They became examples of how violent ideation, when unchecked and obsessive, can culminate in irreversible destruction. In the final analysis, the Bever brothers' trajectory, from teenage isolation to convicted murderers serving life sentences, stands as a chilling cautionary tale. It demands that communities confront the fragile line between adolescence and atrocities. Warning signs should not be dismissed. Systems need to act early and decisively. Because when the fantasy of violence becomes a plan, as it did for Michael and Robert Bever, justice reacts, but at a cost that cannot be undone. If these stories made you think twice, if they gripped you, shocked you, or left you questioning how darkness can take root so young, hit that subscribe button now and become part of the Mindframe True Crimes family. Each week, we go far beyond the headlines to explore the motives, the warning signs, and the psychological dissent behind the most disturbing cases, revealing the hidden truths most are afraid to confront. And now, the Mindframe True Crimes membership is officially live. Join today to unlock exclusive member benefits like early video access, loyalty badges, custom emojis, and priority replies. Whether you're here for the courtroom revelations, the investigative depth, or the psychological unraveling, this is your place. To my loyal subscribers and returning viewers, thank you for keeping your mind in the frame. Your curiosity fuels this mission, and your support makes it possible to keep shining light into the world's darkest corners. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, the mind is the most dangerous place of all. This is Mindframe True Crimes. Until next time.